computer. That sounds right. All right, we're recording. So thank you so much to Ed Zahnhiser for being here. I first met Ed after he sent a very wonderful and generous donation to Wyoming Wilderness Association early in my career here in 2018 to the Youth Ambassadors for Wilderness. And after I received that donation, I reached out to Ed and we kind of developed a cool pen pal relationship, sending emails back and forth, sharing really cool resources and stories. And he's been an inspiration to me for the last 3 years. And in that time, he made the offer to come and speak to the Wyoming Wilderness Association and our community. And so Kale and I have been putting our heads together on how to engage Ed Zahnhiser in a meaningful way with WWA. And of course, the throes of COVID have made that even more complicated. But when we realized we had the opportunity to honor Dennis with an emeritus status, we thought there was no better opportunity to welcome Ed in to speak to the value of wilderness and the good work we're doing here. So thank you, Ed, for being here. Ed wanted to make it clear that Ed was not the one who wrote the Wilderness Act, but it was his father. And Ed is the youngest of 4 children of Howard Zahnhiser and Alice Zahnhiser. Ed retired in 2013 as senior writer and editor for the publications group of the National Park Service, which is the group that produces all of the visitor brochures for the entire national park system. Since the early 1990s, he has given more than 60 talks, trainings, and presentations throughout the United States on wilderness and the work of his father, Howard Zahnhiser, chief architect of the 1964 National Wilderness Preservation System Act. Ed is the editor and contributor to the book Where Wilderness Preservation Began, Adirondack Writings of Howard Zahnhiser. He's also the author of several books and children books of poetry, including Mall Hopping with the Great I Am, which I own and have read, and it's wonderful, Confidence in Being, The Way to Heron Mountain, and At the End of the Self-Help Rope. Ed is currently the Poet Laureate of Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and we are very fortunate to welcome him tonight as the keynote speaker of Dennis Knight's Emeritus Status Celebration. So with that, Ed, thank you, and I'll hand it off to you.
Well, thank you. A very generous intro. I hope you'll show up for my funeral and speak, but not real soon. So I titled the talk tonight, Taking Up the Baton for Wilderness and Wildlife. And thanks, of course, to Peggy for inviting me to share wilderness thoughts with you. And thanks to each of you for doing the important wilderness work of your Wyoming Wilderness Association. And it's a bit intimidating for me to yammer in the presence, even by Zoom, of Dr. Dennis. I hope you'll help me give him a hearty thanks for years of his volunteer service on your association's board and also this emeritus status. So let's do an official clap there. And also not to forget his writings about Wyoming's ecology and the importance of roadless wildlands. Obviously, road building has inspired many a wilderness and wildlands advocacy struggle. So on the behalf of the tradition, Dr. Dennis, we owe you a singular debt of wilderness saving gratitude. So you are an inspiration, and we thank you for your work in witness. The Wilderness Act offers a redefinition of progress, whose history hooks back to the transcendentalists in the mid-1800s, to Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Margaret Sarah Fuller. The Wilderness Act took its impetus and urgency from the proliferation of automobiles after World War II. Robert Marshall and others in the 1920s and 30s had begun talk of protecting roadless areas and primitive areas from being roaded. Historian Paul Sutter's book about the early wilderness movement is titled Driven Wild: How the Automobile Launched the Modern Wilderness Movement. So I hope we can do 3 things here in the time we have. First, see wilderness as a longtime concern of the American people, for the fate of our legacy of federal public domain lands. Second, look at what my father, Howard Zahniser, thought about the role of wilderness in our civilization, how wilderness can help us to discover ourselves as dependent and interdependent members of the whole community of life on Earth. And third, put wilderness in the context of state and federal lands conservation history. These are foundational for messaging about wilderness in your work with the public, opinion makers, agency folk, and lawmakers, and anybody else's arm you can twist. So here's our big idea. When advocating wilderness, we can lay our messages foundations in our nation's public lands conservation history. Wilderness preservation became the 20th century expression of the 18th and 19th century determination of the American people to conserve or to preserve, to protect in their natural state remnants of our once vast federal public domain lands. And these are lands to which Brett Wallach writes, progress would otherwise show no mercy. The urge to preserve wilderness was not a 20th century idea. It did not get its start with the Wilderness Bill in Congress in 1956 or in the 1930s with Robert Marshall and the founding of the Wilderness Society. Concern for wilderness dates back at least the first half of the 19th century, and the 1964 Wilderness Act capped a progression of American attempts to protect remnants of our federal public domain lands in their natural state. There have been three big conservation movements in America: a forest movement, a parks movement, and then the wilderness preservation movement. All three, of course, continue today. But as movements to preserve wild nature on federal public lands, the forest movement was co-opted. Then the parks movement was co-opted. So conservationists tried again with the 1964 Wilderness Act, and its full title is the National Wilderness Preservation System Act. Working through their representatives in Congress, Americans first saw forest reserves established on federal public land under the 1891 Forest Reservation Act. That could be 1881. Forest reserves were true reserves closed to grazing, mining, logging, and homesteading. But then Gifford Pinchot convinced Congress to open the forest reserves to resource extraction and grazing and as national forests. That change sparked the national parks movement. Again, working through Congress, Americans bet on national parks to preserve wild nature on public lands. Rapid growth of the national park system in the 1920s and 30s saw many new parklands carved out of national forests. But National Park Service Director Stephen Mather soon allied the parks movement with automobile tourism. Roads and other development pressures on park backcountry grew as automobile touring proliferated. Pressure to road and otherwise develop park backcountry made the drive to protect wilderness more urgent. The National Park Service Mission 66 program, we used to call it the Passion 66 program, of the 1950s and 60s, similarly convinced wilderness advocates to include national parklands in the Wilderness Act and the National Wilderness Preservation System. Mission 66 had simply recast the Depression-era Civilian Conservation Corps program as a 10-year national park infrastructure construction program. Mission 66 convinced wilderness advocates that wilderness and national parks needed more and better protection. So we have progressed as a nation from forest reserves to national parks and now to the National Wilderness Preservation System. Now, I did not fabricate this history. Its roots persist today in the state of New York's category of forest preserve lands in the Adirondack and Catskill state parks. These lands are protected, quote, as protected forever as wild forest lands by the New York State Constitution. Today, there are 24 designated state wilderness areas in New York. In 1872, the same year that Congress created Yellowstone National Park, New York State established a commission to study creating a state park for the Adirondacks. Why? Because the year before, New York State had found itself a net importer of wood fiber for the first time ever. So in 1885, New York State designated certain state-owned lands as forest preserve lands. That sounds pretty much like forest reserves to come 6 years later on federal public lands. But New York's forest preserve persisted protected. Why? Because it was protected by law, by the state constitution, not by the whims of administrators. Those were arguments used for the Wilderness Act later. This forever wild clause in the New York State Constitution, as it is known, was in fact an acknowledged model for the 1964 Wilderness Act. To change the status of forest preserve lands in New York State requires amending the state constitution, and that's a multi-year process that concludes with a public referendum. So you see, New Yorkers didn't entrust their wilderness to elected officials, but to the ballot box itself. Now, the father of Wilderness Society founder Robert Marshall, the great civil liberties lawyer Lewis Marshall, was a voting delegate to the New York State Constitutional Convention in 1894. And there he championed the Forever Wild clause. And then again, as a convention delegate in 1915, Lewis Marshall led the floor fight that upheld the Forever Wild clause against very powerful political attacks. So New York State succeeded in its own backyard with what the federal government could not make stick on the federal public lands with the 1891 Forest Reservation Act. New York State now has more than 1 million acres of state wilderness on forest preserve lands in the Adirondack and Catskill regions. So the wilderness preservation movement, even on federal public lands, really dates back to the 19th century. And this also underscores our big idea here. When talking to the public and to officials about wilderness, undergird your message with our federal public lands conservation history. But what did my father, Howard Zahniser, who was known as Zahni, what did Zahni mean in terms of the Wilderness Act? What did he mean for the Wilderness Act to mean to you and me today? I think he meant something pretty big. Listen to this language from his 1961 speech, Wilderness Forever, delivered 3 years before the act became law in 1964. Quote, "It is a bold thing for a human being who lives on the earth but a few score years at most, to presume upon the eternal and covet perpetuity for any of our undertakings, to project into the eternity of the future some of that precious, unspoiled ecological inheritance that has come to us out of the eternity of the past." Now, those words paradoxically marry human boldness with our urgent need for ecological humility. My father had learned the newly ecological view of life from Aldo Leopold, Ollis Murray, Edward Preble, and others at the Bureau of Biological Survey, which later became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where he worked in the 1930s and early 1940s. As Zani wrote, quote, "We deeply need the humility to know ourselves as the dependent members of a great community of life. To know the wilderness is to know a profound humility, to recognize one's littleness, to sense dependence and interdependence, indebtedness and responsibility." So wilderness is, quote, "the earth's immortal genius." In part, atomic bombs propelled my father full-time into the wilderness preservation movement in 1945. His act of will to move a national politics to preserve wilderness in perpetuity was a humble refusal to see split the dynamic wholeness of the more than human world. As John Hay wrote, "The whole of life is the source of life. Wilderness is not merely landscapes, but the earth's immortal genius." Aldo Leopold taught us that the work of creating a land ethic is work to extend the ethical boundaries of the community. As a wilderness worker, that's part of your job description. Leopold made land health a moral issue. To preserve wilderness in perpetuity acknowledges that we are not set apart from Earth's immortal genius. To preserve, quote, "an enduring resource of wilderness" recognizes the proper actual bounds of our true community. And isn't the Earth's biosphere, in fact, our true community? In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the wilderness movement watched more and more roads for automobiles methodically carve up and whittle down, that is to modify, the verb used in the Wilderness Act, to modify America's last great wilderness remnants. Progress, this was called. But as Thoreau observed, 10,000 people shouting the truth automatically makes it false. The wilderness and climate activist Bill McKibben, an Adirondacker at heart, says we need wilderness as one of those few places where we can still sense our true human scale. McKibben compares wilderness to soup kitchens and hospitals as other places where transcendent love still plays. So what is our true human scale? McKibben says, existentially, we are so small, but we can matter so much. That's what the religious sounding language in my father's wilderness writing is all about. The boldness of human humility, human biotic humility. And we don't gain humility by seeking it. It works itself into our lives by the discipline of service, like your own work for wilderness and wildness. For us here now, this means the discipline of service to advocate for and to preserve wilderness in Wyoming. I think this is essentially what Zani meant with the Wilderness Act, that we might come to know ourselves, as he wrote, as, quote, dependent members of an interdependent community of living creatures that together derive their existence from the sun. That's S-U-N. But what about you? What might you have in mind now? I would like to suggest that you might see yourself in the role of a modern day shaman. That is, to see yourself as mediating the balance between humans and the more than human world. And that was the shaman's role. It wasn't magic. This wild shaman tradition that you can embody has been here in North America on Turtle Island, as some indigenes call it, since the beginning of time. When the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber wrote out his profoundly relational view of human life in 1923, he included our I-thou relationship with nature. Deep subjectivity with the more than human world was not invented by deep ecology. So look, the world contains many things that exist but cannot be collected and put someplace. The set of complex numbers, gravity, dreams, wildness, maybe wilderness even, because beauty hovers still, as Olis Murray suggested, without a dollar sign. So you are like the leader of our wild community. We call you wilderness advocate. You have great responsibility in our community, but no authority except how compelling your message is. We seek better balance between the human community and the more than human world, what we have called nature. Wilderness advocacy for nature, yet about culture, means being a voice for mediating and keeping that balance like a shaman. The Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures verb that we translate as to know was often used in a sexual context, not facts, but connection, knowledge, not as accumulation, but as charge and discharge, not a hoard of certainties, not taxonomy, but a release of energy, the dance. It is the livingness we want, a living wilderness, wilderness in perpetuity. In his one lifetime of thinking and writing, Aldo Leopold took how we think about nature from seeing so-called game management, like industrial livestock husbandry, all the way to articulating a land ethic whose ethical viewpoint might someday give wildness, for example, legal standing in court. Isn't that amazing? And this is your national conservation heritage. What does it mean to preserve biodiversity? I remember standing as a boy, age 15, excuse me, on a river bar of the Shinjek River in the Brooks Range, Alaska, in 1961, as Olis Murray made a cast of a wolf track immaculately pressed into immaculately pressed into gray glacial river silt, like a precious object carved out of metal. Suddenly the rain stopped. Clouds of mosquitoes flew into action. Olis, hatless and thin of hair with a gray mix of mud and water putty all over his hands, began gently brushing the mosquitoes off his head so as not to injure them. And I thought, so this is what untrammeled means. That odd descriptor of wilderness my father used in the Wilderness Act, untrammeled by humans. Biodiversity records how life arrived at itself. As a species and individuals, you and I are motile memory, imagining wilderness today. We are the planet remembering itself. At Dinosaur National Monument in Utah, there are plants adapted to live only in specific soils weathered from the exposed strata of one geological formation laid down by ancient seas eons before the dinosaurs lived. And remember how Noah took 2 of each creature aboard the ark, even those then thought to be ritually unclean. Biodiversity, the whole community of life on Earth. So you are the inheritor not just of 70 years of wilderness thought, but of 7,000 years of reverence for life, of all those before us who have spoken I, thou to nature, who whispered I, thou under the spell of the sensuous. The Wilderness Act redefined progress in line with Thoreau's startling assertion that, quote, in wildness is the preservation of the world. And Thoreau uses the word world in its Greek sense, cosmos, spelled with a K, which means not only world, but also order, beauty, and pattern. I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness, Thoreau wrote. And wildness is the individual's wellspring for the social conscience, declared in Thoreau's essay, Resistance to Civil Government, in opposition of slavery and the war with Mexico. And those are what inspired Mohandas Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this too is part of our conservation history. The great Roman poet Horace died 4 years before Jesus of Nazareth was born. In the recent David Ferry translations of the Odes, Horace records, today I have finished a work outlasting bronze and the pyramids of ancient royal kings. The north wind raging cannot scatter it, nor can the rain obliterate this work, nor can the years, nor can the ages passing. Some part of me will live and not be given over into the hands of the deaf goddess. The Wilderness Act was crafted by the wilderness community in the 1950s to be a work outlasting bronze. And that is your legacy as you work for wilderness. The Wilderness Act was crafted, quote, to project into the eternity of the future some of that precious, unspoiled ecological inheritance that has come down to us out of the eternity of the past. The Wilderness Act was meant to be, quote, a work outlasting bronze. Hear the hope expressed in my father's words, quote, to presume upon the eternal and covet perpetuity. As Doug Scott has said, the early Wilderness Society nucleus made key policy decisions in the late 1930s and early 1940s. 1, wilderness is a natural resource in itself. 2, we need wilderness in a fundamental way. 3, wilderness is imperiled and disappearing, and there is an element of crisis about this. 4, it has to be saved, which is your job. And 5, when we save wilderness, we are not saving it as a luxury, but in perpetuity, a work outlasting bronze. In 1930, Bob Marshall declared, quote, there is just one hope of repulsing the tyrannical ambition of civilization to conquer every niche on the whole earth. And that hope is the organization of spirited people who will fight for the freedom of the wilderness. Bob Marshall, 1930. So you have joined that spirited people and you embody that one hope now. On behalf of the tradition, on behalf of our great cloud of witnesses, thank you for what you do and what you will keep on doing to expand the boundaries of the community, to help people want to neighbor our biosphere, to help people cherish the freedom of the wilderness. Thank you for running your leg of this great wilderness relay race. Thank you for doing your part to preserve the Earth's immortal genius. Now firmly grasp that baton, go forth, do good, tell the stories, and keep wilderness wild. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, so much. How inspiring. I definitely wrote down some quotes and some different things to encourage all of us. And we're so grateful for your thoughts and the words that you put together to help us not only honor the work that we do, but Dr. Dennis Knight, who has spent a long time volunteering, but not only just volunteering on this board, but serving for conservation as a larger part in all the work that he's done. So we are so grateful for the time that you've spent with us. I know everybody here is so thankful for the words that you've spoken tonight, and I'm excited to put together all the different little quotes that I jotted down. My favorite, a work outlasting bronze. So let's raise a glass to Dr. Dennis Knight, to the Wilderness Act, and the work that we do that will outlast bronze. Cheers, everybody.
Amen.
Yay.
Thank you.
Cheers.
So it's great to be with you all. Have a great rest of your meetings and celebration.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank
you, Ed.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Yeah,
so much.
and,
Thank you, Ed. That was great.
thanks to Peggy for inviting me and to
To
working,
many more, Ed. This
working,
is just the beginning.
working as my remote brain to figure out what time it is in Arizona, what time it is in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, whether it's April 21 or April 30 or what, you know. So I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great job, Ed. Thank you.
Okay.
Great to see
Thank
you.
you.
Well, thank you
Thanks
so much,
for everything.
everybody. I want to respect everyone's time, and I know Dennis has to get on the road as well, but I think we have a lot of food for thought. I know that that was recorded. I'm excited to listen to it again and pull out some real great nuggets that we can use for our future board meetings and other discussions that we have. So Ed, again, another thank you for joining us tonight. And Dr. Dennis Knight, another huge thank you for being a part of this board, and congratulations on your emeritus status. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you,
you.
everybody.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
all.
Cheers.
That concludes our evening. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Have a great night.